Hi, welcome to the Political Forum podcast. This is episode number 5. And for each episode, we discuss current events, commentary on culture and society, philosophy, and of course, politics. Before I introduce you to tonight's guest, I want to introduce you and thank the members of our team. So tonight, co-moderating with me is my friend John Kerbau. Hello, John.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing fine, thanks. And also joining us is Anat to assist us. Hi, Anat. Good to see you. And our guest tonight is Rajiv. Rajiv is a graduate of the University of Michigan and Stanford, and he's currently working at Amazon as a software developer. In his free time, he enjoys reading and writing about philosophy and is currently working on a book about morality. Just as a point of reference, Rajiv has participated in a number of live Oxford debates that we have here at the forum, including the one on the Second Amendment, Islam and secularism, and most recently on the topic of compulsory education. Now, some of these videos are available on our YouTube channel, so definitely do check it out. So folks, here we are, the last day of June of 2021. So how is your summer going so far?
It's been interesting and exciting. You know, we've definitely all had a long year of not being able to do the kind of things we wanted to do, not being able to go traveling, not being able to spend as much time indoors and hanging out with friends. So it's very good to see, the light at the end of the tunnel. And I was very personally super excited to get vaccinated, I think a month and a half ago. And the world definitely felt very different as soon as I got vaccinated. I feel like a lot of the precautions that I had self-imposed on myself, I no longer had to worry about. And it just felt very liberating to be able to go out there and just kind of try to live my life the way I used to. So it's been a good summer so far, and I'm looking forward to more of it.
Yeah. Are there any major adjustments that you had to undertake to kind of get used to the reopening?
I feel like I'm a little bit in between being an introvert and being an extrovert. I definitely enjoy social contact. I enjoy interacting with people, but at the same time, I've kind of realized that beyond that, spending a lot of time interacting with people kind of tires me out to a certain extent. So actually about a week ago, I went to my first kind of happy hour mass gathering type event. And I think I was there for about 2.5 hours, and I felt really exhausted at the end of it. I was like, wow, that's actually the first time in a long time that I've been, in a room full of 100 other people, just going around, meeting random people, introducing myself, making small talk. And it's one of those things where I haven't had practice with it for a long time. So I just have to slowly get used to it again.
Yeah, that's a good point. What about when you see people in terms of being in physical contact or being within proximity, for instance, when you're shaking hands, patting somebody on the back? I mean, is that something you're kind of getting used to, or what do you think?
I think the first 1 or 2 handshakes that I did definitely felt a little bit. It was a new sensation because I've been consciously avoiding it for a year and a half. But I feel like I've been vaccinated, and I trust that probably the majority of people in New York City have been vaccinated. So that's really relieved a lot of my anxiety. So at this point, I feel pretty comfortable with it.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're kind of coming out of the introvert side and kind of crossing over to the extrovert side. Is that a safe assumption?
Yeah. I would say I'm getting used to being in more social situations and spending more time talking to people again. So I'm never going to be a full extrovert the way my wife is. My wife is a complete 100% extrovert, but I'm probably going to be somewhere in the middle.
It's a good place to be.
What's interesting is, despite being, in semi-lockdown for the last year and 4 months, I guess there are some positives that came out of it, right?
I guess I'm not sure if the video is frozen. Are you guys able to hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Just seems like Thomas's video is frozen. But yeah, I think one of the positives that came out of it for me is just being able to experiment with remote working. and kind of having the flexibility of working from home and working remotely. I know this is something that, like, especially within the tech industry, because I work as a software developer, people have been talking about working for a very long time, but there's been very few big major companies that have embraced a fully remote first work culture. So I feel like over the last year and a half, it's definitely been like a unique experiment that the whole industry and kind of the whole world to a lot of extent has been experimenting with. And there's definitely a lot of positives and negatives that people have experienced with remote working. It definitely feels like it's harder to build the home work separation. It's easy to like get everything mingled in and get burnt out that way. But on the flip side, I think people have also realized that remote working can be a very productive way to work. So a lot of the fears that people had, they weren't really realized. A lot of the companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, we were still able to continue operating and continue being productive, even though we were remote for the last year and a half. So that was a fun experiment to be a part of.
Well, I wanted to ask you something. I feel like this pandemic has unearthed and kind of excavated a deeper conversation about something that used to be very taboo in our society. So there's a sort of religious dogma. It's not technically religious, but it's very dogmatic. This sort of puritanical idea of working, this idea that you cannot work from home, this sort of 8-hour work week. I feel like that's been sort of enshrined informally into the fabric of our culture and how we work. And on the side or beneath the surface, a lot of like social science research has shown that it's actually not as productive, that there are very productive ways to sort of work less than 8 hours a day, or 40-hour work week isn't always the best. People can work from home. People can be, this really is the conversation that the movie Office Space tried to start almost 20 years ago. And somehow that movie was wildly popular as a comedy, but it never caught on to our discourse about productivity. And I think the pandemic has sort of forced us to have that conversation about work. Is it okay to question dogmas when it comes to the culture of work at Amazon or at any corporation? Because that is sort of the status quo religion for, the modern times, this culture of like how we work. And people knew a lot of it was BS, and they knew there was room to question things. But I feel like people never had real permission to until they were forced to actually experiment and run that experiment in real life for like a year. So yeah, I didn't know if you had a take on that. Like, do you think this will create a wider, did the pandemic sort of incubate a wider conversation about questioning this dogma? And might this get us more willing to question dogmas in the future, to say it's okay to question our assumptions, and maybe there's better ways to do things,
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on, very fascinating and I think very relevant topic that we should be discussing. I definitely feel like within the tech industry, and maybe it's a little bit of a bubble, I don't know what the wider society might be like, there's definitely been a lot of talk about moving away from the 9-to-5 corporate environment, office space type lifestyle that you talked about, and really looking for an alternative way of living. There's been a big FIRE movement within the tech industry, which is, I think it's been there for many years, but now it's catching on. I'll give a little bit of a brief explanation. FIRE basically stands for Financially Independent Retire Early. The idea is that, hey, Thomas.
Sorry about that. I had a power outage, which was very unexpected.
No worries. Yeah, John asked me a question about, trends that might be happening in the software industry around remote working and how people might be reconsidering the nature of work and the 9-to-5 and so on. And I was talking briefly about the FIRE movement and how it's becoming more and more, it's gathering a lot of steam in the tech industry. So FIRE basically stands for Financially Independent Retire Early, which was something that, I think it first started to gain some traction, I think probably 10 years ago. And it's become very popular in the tech industry and probably to some extent outside the tech industry as well. The idea behind FIRE is that, traditionally the lifestyle people have always had is that they get a good high paying job and then they upgrade their lifestyle to fit whatever their income is. So, if you're making 100,000 a year, then maybe you save 10 or 20,000 and then you spend the other 80,000. you get a nice house, you get a nice car, whatever. And let's say your career does really well, and 5 years later, you're making 200,000 a year. At that point, maybe you save $20,000 a year, and then you start spending 160 or 180K a year. So the idea is that, whatever money you make, you save some of it, and then you upgrade your lifestyle to fill the rest. The FIRE movement really turned this on its head and said, you know what, instead of trying to work for 40 years from your 20s until your 60s, and instead of upgrading your lifestyle every time you make more money, what if you did the opposite? What if you just, figured out a baseline lifestyle that you're happy with, that you're content with, and then just stick to that and save as much money as you can. And this way, instead of retiring in your 50s and 60s, you can really retire in your 30s. So there's been a lot of examples that I've come across of people who are like saving 50% or more of their salary. And they're really able to focus on investing it and living frugally. And by doing all that, they're able to retire in their 30s with a nest egg that it's not going to give them an extravagant lifestyle, but it's able to pay the bills and pay for rent and pay for the life expenses in a low cost of living area. So instead of having to work 9 to 5 for decades and decades, they really are focusing on working for 10, 15 years and then retiring and then living a frugal life. And I think that this whole pandemic and having to work remotely for the last year and a half has given people a lot of taste for freedom. And I think a lot of people have been hearing anecdotally talking about wanting to continue with that through the FIRE movement and not having to lose their freedom and go back to the 9 to 5 corporate lifestyle. I think there's also been a lot of focus towards people wanting to embrace the nomadic lifestyle in terms of, not having to go to an office, but instead being fully remote and just traveling around the world. There's long been a phenomena of software developers who call themselves digital nomads, which is really people who travel around the world. They go to places like Thailand, Eastern Europe, Africa, South America, and they're just staying in each place for 2 months or 3 months at a time. And they're really working off their computers. They have clients all over the world in America and Europe, and they're just working online through the computer. And they really want to focus their life towards, traveling around the world, especially in places with low cost of living, and using the fact that they have a online career and working style in order to fund and also allow them flexibility to travel around. And I think this is also something that anecdotally a lot of people have been talking about continuing even after the pandemic ends. I know that many decades ago, I think it was John Maynard Keynes, or maybe it was someone else, but someone would predicted that in the 21st century, people aren't going to work more than 5 or 10 hours a week. Because when economists looked at how productivity was improving and how per capita income was improving, they saw that by the time we get to the 21st century, we only need to work for 10 hours a week to maintain the same quality of living that people had 100 years ago, which is true. If you work for 10 hours a week, you can maintain the same quality of living that someone had 100 years ago. I think the problem is that there's been a rising expectation in society that in order to be successful, you need to have a big house and a flashy car and so on. So even though our quality of life keeps growing and even though our productivity keeps growing, our expectations also keep growing. So now people feel as though they have to work for 40, 50, 60 hours a week. And when you look at absolute terms, we're far, far richer than we used to be 100 years ago. And yet, I think if you ask most people, they would say that, I would actually like to have the same lifestyle that my grandfather had while being able to work for 10 hours a week. So I would like to see us, really having the conversation around, do we really want to work 40 hours a week and have, super fancy cars and a nice TV and all these things? Or would we as a society be happier if we were to work, 2 to 3 days a week and had a lot more free time, and we were to give up some of the more luxury comforts that we are used to?
Yeah, it's a conversation about the psychology, the deeper psychology of happiness. And I know that philosophies like stoicism, thousands of years ago, uncovered this conversation about what really drives the deeper question of human well-being, not just happiness on a superficial level, not just drunk in a bar happiness, but a deeper level of contentment. And I think I think it really requires us to accept that a lot of our assumptions about what makes us happy in the long run as a culture and as people are not necessarily true. And it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to say, can we make this adjustment? But I think there's a barrier to doing that in some cases. I think there's this sort of ingrained cultural and political sort of ideology that says this is what happiness is. But at the same time, COVID may have really disrupted a lot of that. So I think people are rethinking the happiness formula on every level, on the personal microscopic level and on a macro level. And I think that may have opened the door for talking about what you're talking about. Do you ever look at how to cross compare experiments in this around the world? I mean, I know every culture is different, geography and borders make a difference, but in terms of human nature, the common correlates of human happiness and the way we flourish with family, friends, sense of self. I mean, you look across cultures, and I say this as someone who's been around the world. Like when I was in the Army, I would deal with suicide bombers and people who joined insurgency. And now out of the Army, I saw the common patterns of how people get radicalized to become white supremacists or neo-Nazis, or the people that stormed the Capitol on January 6th. And there's a lot of disturbing patterns in terms of what these things have in common. And a lot of what they have in common is people having trouble relating to themselves and a sense of identity and a sense of self and then lacking a sense of community, or they find community, which is, I think, an evolutionarily hardwired need, but they find it in the wrong places with the wrong people. So you look at the correlates of how people become extremists or how they flourish with a family and live like Frodo Baggins or on the Shire, whatever, Samwise Gamgee or whatever. You look at the spectrum of human happiness and you see a lot of the same patterns. People need a sense of identity, community, and a purpose. And I feel like if we focus on that aspect of human nature, it can guide our compass a lot better. You're saying we're starting to see that people might not be as with a Ferrari, or for most people it'd be BMW, whatever. I don't know. I'm not a car expert, but people fill that vacuum. They're always struggling to fill that vacuum with something. They always want to be, they want to fill their sense of purpose, whether they're 20 years old or they're having a midlife crisis, whatever age bracket, whatever their life situation is. People are always trying to fill that happiness vacuum. And it usually fails if they try to do it with a nice car. But if they try to do it by having a sincere inner monologue about who they are, and if they try to if they're able to really relate to themselves and their family and their friends and just find that kind of solace, I feel like that, even scientifically at the level of neuroscience, is much a better model of happiness. So yeah, could this get us to rethink our very paradigm of what is happiness? This touches deeper, I think.
No, 100%. I think you're definitely right on the money in the sense that, people really need a sense of purpose and identity in life. And a lot of times, people try to fill that void with things like career success. And so they work themselves really, really hard because they think, well, if I'm successful in my career, if people give me a promotion, if my boss tells me I'm doing a good job, that validates me as a human being. And they're looking for the validation, and they're looking for it in things like, material possessions or fame or career success. And so they really pursue those things. And I think, as you said it perfectly, those are things that will leave you feeling hollow. If you really just focus on chasing fame or career success, you will find a time in your 40s and 50s when you realize that it doesn't really taste all that meaningful. You still feel alone. And I think that really gets to the other part of what you're talking about, which is a lot of people who've been radicalized, whether overseas or even closer to home, it's really because they feel like they're missing that sense of community and they're missing their place in the world. And so they're looking for something, some community, some understanding of the world that makes them feel like they have a place in that world. And when you look at all these conspiracies like, QAnon and all these things, it's really people who feel left out. They feel like the world has moved on and they've slipped through the cracks. And they're really looking for a way to fit themselves back in the world and make sense of the world with them in it. And that's why they turn to these conspiracies. I really think that, America's communal ties and social ties have probably become more frayed in the last couple of decades. I think one of the really great books that I read in university was about bowling alone, which, is really talking about how civic togetherness and communal ties used to be much stronger, probably in most of the Western world many decades ago, much more so than they are now. And I think that's really a sad thing. I really think that, happiness comes from a number of things, and social ties is a big part of that. So
Right.
I think the last
What was the name of the book you said?
bowling alone,
Living Alone?
bowling alone,
Oh,
bowling. Like when you
Gotcha.
go to a bowling alley and you're bowling
oh,
alone.
yeah, Big Lebowski, my all-time favorite comedy. Here you go, bowling, right?
But here's a question now. When you look at happiness on an individualistic level, does it seem it's a very kind of relative state of being? Because I remember reading about this. So there's a very famous psychological study that was done. What they did was they surveyed, on one hand, lottery winners, and on the other hand, accident victims from really horrible car accidents. And these accident victims would be, they would lose their limb or, suffer a really debilitating, illness, permanent. And when they asked both groups, a month or two after each of their respective, life-changing events, obviously the lottery winner said, oh, I'm, super elated. I give 10 out of 10 in terms of happiness. And then the accident victims will say, I give myself 1 out of 10. I'm just miserable because I can't do the things that I used to do. Even things like going for a walk, I take it for granted. But then when they ask them about 2 years later, it turns out that their happiness index is pretty similar. They'll say, well, it's about 5 out of 10 or 6 out of 10. And what happens is, the lottery winners, at first they were just overwhelmed with joy from having so much money all at once. But then they find out that, little by little, having all this money causes all kinds of complications and problems. And they're less happy than before they won the lottery. Likewise, when they asked the accident victims, they said, yeah, life was kind of miserable the first few months, but, I was able to go through therapy. I got myself back together, and I'm actually happier now because there are certain things that I'm, discovering about myself. So I think the moral to the story, assuming this, study is somewhat representative, is that humans are highly adaptable. And we're just kind of, social creatures. So we will find ways to adapt. And, I think to Rajiv's point earlier, I think now we're starting to adapt again to, different, I guess the new world in a post-pandemic setting. So what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the psychological term for this concept we're talking about is probably the hedonic treadmill, which is the idea that, let's say you grew up all your life eating really shitty food that's not tasty at all, and then you just got used to it. And then all of a sudden one day someone introduces you to Michelin star, super fancy, really tasty food. It's going to taste amazing to you for a while. But if you have it every single day for 10 years down the road, you're going to feel the exact same way that you did before, back when you're eating the very non-tasty food. It's just the hedonic treadmill. Your mind kind of gets used to these material extrinsic pleasures, and it kind of gets used to it to the point where it no longer even notices it. In fact, I think the other study they did was about living in a fancy house with a really nice view. And what they found was that the first couple of months, it feels great. But in the long run, living in a house with a really nice view doesn't actually make you happier or feel more satisfied with life. It's, again, they had in a treadmill, you just feel like you're running faster, but you're still running in the same place eventually. That's kind of that's where the treadmill analogy comes in. But I think you're absolutely right. I think they have found certain factors that do play a role in long-term happiness. I think what they have found was that, having a sense of purpose in the world, something that you care about, something that you're working towards, that you actually feel a sense of purpose to it. And also having communal ties and family ties that are close and strong so that you don't feel lonely or isolated. I think these are a couple of things that they found actually do make people happier in the long run, not just in the short run. So I think, trying to find a way to look past the things that make you happier only in the short run and really focusing on the things that can give you long lasting happiness and satisfaction. That's something that I try to do personally.
Let me get a question in while John unmutes. So Rajiv, having lived in different parts of the world, how would you compare the social fabric of the US versus other parts of the world?
Yeah. I grew up in both India and Singapore. And by the way, John, you were on mute. That's why we couldn't hear you. Um, so yeah, I think both in India and Singapore, I definitely noticed that there were more close family ties and even more close neighborly ties, more than the average place in America. That's what I noticed. I think one of the things that surprised me was that if you live in the suburbs in America, most people have no idea who their neighbors are. And most people don't really make an effort to hang out with their neighbors, which to me, I will actually find, I usually found very surprising in a general case. Because, when I was growing up in India, I used to live in India until I was about 7 years old. Um, Me and all my neighbors, like we knew each other extremely well. Like I knew every single kid in my neighborhood. My parents knew every single adult in our neighborhood, and we all used to meet up together and have these neighborhood social events every now and then. Singapore was probably a little bit closer to America, but even in Singapore, I felt like it was more common for people to build communities within their neighborhood. I think in America, this definitely feels more of a lone sensation, in the sense that people like to do their own thing. They like to form their own smaller social networks, but usually that doesn't include their neighbors. It doesn't include their first cousins. It doesn't include their second cousins. And I think one of the things that I found a little bit surprising is that a lot of people only see their family during Thanksgiving and Christmas, and they don't make
Right.
an effort to see and hang out with their family on a more regular basis.
This
So
is a great, this is a great point. I think during if you, I did a lot of research about the way cities develop. Like Jane Jacobs wrote a wonderful book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities, and how a lot of it used to be more bottom up and organic. So like during the 80s, for example, I think that may have been kind of the cutoff point where these social ties were much more common. And I think in America, at least in America. But so it would be interesting to have a conversation about revisiting how to rekindle these ties. And now social media and tech has sort of filled that vacuum. But if everybody's swiping on Tinder or Bumble or Grindr or whatever they're doing, or they're always getting outraged on social media based on flame wars or echo chambers, then they're not really connecting on the interpersonal level. And we, as you probably know from neuroscience, when people see other people's faces, they have that interpersonal contact. That's when you have the empathy neurons. That's when you really relate to people. That's when you have the mirror neurons. You're like, I can relate to this person because I'm seeing them. I can imagine what it's like to be them. I can read their facial expressions. Or even if you're a little more well-trained, you start to see the micro expressions, like a genuine smile or whatever it is. And I think I don't know. I feel like big tech needs to merge with the humanities when it comes to human nature and human happiness and human flourishing, and have a really good conversation. Create like a moral technology incubator. I know the term moral psychology is widespread, like Jonathan Haidt, and what really makes us happy, what do we get outraged about? But what if you coined a new term, moral technology? How do you merge big tech with happiness? And I'm sure people have had these nerdy conversations forever. Like this is like a typical Sam Harris podcast. Like I know people talk about this, but are people having these conversations in Amazon right now? How do you try to work out the kinks in social media? Because like I could tell you, a lot of dating apps really suck for men and women in different ways. There's some good things about them, but a lot of times they suck and they make us feel more isolated and distant. In some ways, they bring us closer, though. How do you separate? How do you do like a Jeet Kune Do where you separate what works from what doesn't work, and try to amplify human happiness through technology based on those neural correlates of humanity? Is that yeah?
No, that's a really good question. I can tell you that people definitely think and talk about this. I think more so, I used to work at Google, and I feel like at Google, people had very high-minded ideals. I think it's a couple of problems that get in the way of making this a reality. The first is that building a new company is actually extremely hard to do. Like people usually say that, if you want to be a startup entrepreneur and build a new company, you basically have to be willing to put yourself through extreme risk, and also, work extremely long hours. Probably will have to subject yourself to a lifestyle that is not good for your own mental health and your own life happiness. So you kind of have a self-selection effect where the people who have the attitude that you have, for example, they wouldn't want to subject themselves to the lifestyle of trying to build a startup themselves because they know it's unhealthy and it's going to be extremely demanding. And so then they don't end up becoming those founders to begin with. And the second problem we have is that, it's also really hard to build a startup. And one of the things that makes it possible is having big investors invest in your company. And usually, in order for a big investor to invest in your company, they would only do so if they think they're going to make a lot of money on your company. So if you want to build a socially minded startup, for example, where you avoid building features that are going to make a lot of money because you don't think it's right for society and you don't think it's right for your customers, you're not going to be very profitable. And because you're not very profitable, you're not going to get the big investors writing you the big checks in order to build the startups, which makes it really hard for a startup to succeed. That said, I think there are a few companies that are trying to do stuff like this, like Headspace, for example. They've tried to build mobile apps that encourage people to be more mindful and practice mindfulness. So you do see companies coming along every now and then, encouraging people to do things that are, good for their mental health and those kind of things. But at the same time, I feel like the startups that become super famous and the ones that become super big, they're usually big and famous because they're really focused on making a lot of money, and they have founders who are focused on making a lot of money, and that's why they got big and famous. But that said, if you're looking for technology solutions that can try to make your life a little bit better, there are a lot of these technology solutions out there. They're usually not famous, so you're gonna have to do a little bit of digging to find them. Like, for example, there are apps out there that can help you to remind you to turn off your phone and kind of
Right.
get yourself away from screens, limit your screen time, and all these
Interesting.
things. So,
Do you know about Nextdoor app? It seems like a very neighborhood-driven, community-driven. You reinforce hidden social connections at the level of a neighborhood, whereas very local, bottom up, grassroots kind of is. I feel like that could be a good model, but like you said, the social rate of return is different than the financial rate of return.
absolutely, I've heard of the Nextdoor app, but I've actually never used it myself. So, if any of you guys have used it, I'd be super curious to hear about your experiences using this app and what it was like.
I haven't. I want to. There's an app called Seva Exchange. I know the CEO. She's awesome, and her name's Anita. Seva is about Seva in Sanskrit means self-service. It's basically a digital medium, kind of like Facebook, to exchange skills and needs or motivations and needs. So it's like, I need someone to do this or help teach me this or babysit my dog or pay my house, whatever. And then people can volunteer their time using their skills and motivations to help other people. And in return, instead of money, they get time credits. It's based on time banking, the idea back in, I think, 95 by Edgar Kahn. It's a very profound concept where it's a non-monetized version of credit where you get time credits. So your volunteer labor is not paid in money, it's paid in time credits. Then people are going to want to help you out in return. This kind of goes back, I think, indirectly to the reciprocal altruism of how primates arguably evolve when it comes to morality and moral, reciprocal exchange, where it's like you scratch my back, I scratch yours. But this is at a more advanced level where you get the dopamine rush or the reward chemicals of I'm helping my neighbor. So even if you're not a good person, you might kind of want to start helping people because you feel better. And if you are a good person, or what is a spectrum, obviously, you don't need that reward chemical. You just kind of know what's right. But in any case, wherever you are in the spectrum, whether you need the dopamine rush or you just want to help people, this allows you to do it in a digital way on your phone. It's like, I can help this person get the time credits, then people are going to want to help me. So it's kind of reputation based. That's an awesome idea. And I feel like that could blow up if it's done the right way.
That is really cool. What is the URL to this website?
It's called sevaexchange.com. I can actually see the link, but it's relatively new. They're still developing some of the technical aspects, but the model, the overall layouts there, the model works. We're trying to do proof of concept and develop it in different cities. So I'm working to test it out here in Hudson and New York City and maybe Raleigh, North Carolina. But all you need is a community. You can have a mutual aid community where, and this could work really well after a natural disaster like Hurricane Sandy, where you had these like self-organizing volunteer groups come together to identify what do people need, how do you deliver it to them. Yeah, it's called our tech person's awesome. It's SevaExchange.com.
That's awesome.
So,
I'm looking at the website
yeah.
right now. Looks like a really cool idea.
Yeah, Jamie, pull up that clip. SevaExchange.com. Awesome.
Interesting. Hey, but if I could offer a contrarian view of this notion of a moral technology, I mean, I think morality should be taken out of the equation when it comes to tech. And here's why. Because as we are more dependent on technology, our everyday lives, tech is becoming more of like a utility. Just like when there's utility, in terms of telephone lines, electrical grids, roads, you don't want there to be morality based on it. You just want it to work effectively and efficiently. And to me, I kind of look at tech that way too, in terms of, these apps and programs that they develop. I think what they should do is make it very user-friendly and adaptable. And, if something does not work, then people just stop, using it or downloading it. And I think it's really up to us as humans to use it properly to enhance our livelihood. I think to just simply rely on tech to, solve everything, the ills of our society, I'm not sure if that's the right solution. So I think that's my contrarian view when it comes to morality and technology.
Yeah, no, I definitely hear where you're coming from. It's just that, ultimately the burden falls on us to regulate ourselves and manage our own lives. I guess, one analogy we could look here is kind of like drugs, for example. We all recognize that, like, if you're a drug dealer and you're going around selling heroin to people and you tell them, hey, what you do with this heroin is up to you. It's up to you to manage your own life. I feel like to some extent, most people would say that, like, you as a drug dealer, you are somewhat morally at fault for selling something that is going to harm other people. And granted, you can say that, it is really up to everyone to make sure they don't take drugs, live a healthy life and everything. But at the same time, I feel like the person selling you drugs, knowing that it's bad for you, it seems morally fishy as well. Now, obviously, tech is totally different from drugs. It's it's not a easy parallel to make. But I think, what could be a little bit more concerning is things like gamification of behaviors that might be bad for you. So, like, for example, I think when you look at social networks like Facebook and Twitter, they might have realized during the product prototyping process that encouraging controversy and encouraging, people to say radical things, which then draw other people to get upset, and then they say radical things back to them. They realize that it creates engagement in the platform. They realize that it makes people want to use the platform more and use the platform more frequently when they do this sort of gamification of unhealthy behaviors. And at that point, you have to ask yourself, okay, as someone who's working at this at Twitter or Facebook, for example, I know that if I build this feature, I can get people to use my product more frequently. But I also know that by building this feature, I'm encouraging people to do something which I think is not healthy for them. I'm encouraging people to get into like online flame wars. I'm encouraging people to like post things for the sake of controversy or to flame each other. Should I be going out of my way to build these features, which I know are going to lead to an unhealthy outcome? I think this is one of those things where I don't think it's possible for the law to regulate it. I don't think it's possible for the law to come in and say, this is morally good or this is morally bad, because it's way too nuanced and it's so fast-paced and so quickly changing.
Well,
and I think it really falls on, each software developer in each company to really, I would hope, think critically for themselves about, do I feel good about what I'm doing? And am I making a positive difference to society?
Yeah, I think the analogy to a drug dealer is actually quite, poignant one, because there were some studies done recently which shows that apps like Facebook and even Google, they have these alert systems where they make the platform so addictive, and they reward the user by these alerts and sounds and other signals, where it really elevates the dopamine level that we generate. And I think their business model is, hey, let's try to get these users on using our platforms, on a consistent basis, which is kind of similar to what drug dealers do. Because again, when you're in a business of selling illegal substances, you want them to be addicted so they come back, and you need repeat customers. So I think in some ways there are some very eerie similarities. And I just think that as just a general commentary in our culture, and I'm sure I'm part of it too, is that we're just very passive users of these platforms. And it's like, there are times when we need to kind of wean off of it and not be completely dependent on it, where it really kind of substitutes, your daily interaction with, face-to-face or, other social setting. And I think that we've kind of become a society where, these apps and tools are replacing, the old, social fabric. So.
Yep, absolutely. I agree with that. I think one of the things that I've really tried to do over the last 10 years is try to reduce my addiction to, these gamifications and things like that. So one of the things I've definitely done is turned off my notifications for things like Twitter, Facebook, even email. And I really try to limit my screen time to as few times a day as possible. I've definitely noticed that when I allow myself to get addicted to social media and the feedback loops that these social media have provided, where they give you points and they make you feel good when you post something and then people agree with you and you enjoy all the attention and you enjoy this sudden rush of things happening. I've definitely noticed how it has an impact on my sense of identity and the way my mind works. And I've really had to be very mindful to pull myself back and disconnect myself regularly, just so I can try to keep a healthy disconnect from these things.
Interesting. So there's a quote from one of my probably my favorite crime drama movie called Layer Cake. It was arguably the role that got Daniel Craig the James Bond role, but it was made in 2004. It was a British movie about the drug trade in London, and it really basically there's a quote in it where Daniel Craig says, "As long as you don't take a piss, they're going to come back for more." And it was about the business side of dealing, these pills. And the idea was that if you remove morality from the equation, you just look at human incentives, you look at being the good middleman and facilitating trade based on what people want. If you take that objective understanding, then you can capitalize on addiction and monetize it. And here, this is interesting because gamification and addiction to video games ties into addiction to flame wars and how information warfare operatives in the Kremlin radicalize everyone from white young incels in their mom's basement to extremely angry far left feminists to everyone in between. There's ways to radicalize, to have a fake, one of the fake accounts uncovered by Christian Piccolicini. He's a guy I know, he's a former white supremacist who's turned into an anti-hate operative for the last 20 years. He's one of the leading voices in de-radicalizing white extremists. And before the Trump election, he uncovered this account that was basically a guy from St. Petersburg who had a fake Black Lives Matter account, an ISIS account, and also a white supremacist, a neo-Nazi account. He had all these accounts. And he used this to start flame wars based on the psychology of polarization. And they've done studies on the brain where I think Emory University did this years ago, 2004, I believe, where you get this reward chemical, this rush, you feel really good when your beliefs are validated. So they use this to polarize people, to get people in these echo chambers. But they also use the tribalism ingrained in us by evolution to hate our enemies and to say, you're an outgroup, you're a rival tribe. And that polarizes people. So anybody talking about, something, an opinion might be seen as a categorical enemy. Then people move further and they polarize more into their moral tribes. And this creates a better environment for extremists to operate and for disinfo operatives to troll people and push them, to socially engineer them and nudge them into their respective groups. Just by dropping one tweet, just by showing a fake video of a feminist pouring bleach on white people on the subway in New York City to get them to check their white privilege. That was fake. That was the Russians. I mean, I can send you the link. I'm writing a book on this. And I have like done all this research. I'm like, holy crap, these people really, the Kremlin has been better. They've been the best at doing this because they've done it since Lenin. All they do is they stick to the fundamentals: human nature, polarization, tribalism, addiction to reward chemicals. They've been able to hack the mindset of evangelical groups, communists, everyone. It's the same principles. It's the same principles as Daniel Craig talked about in Layer Cake when he's talking about, get them to come back for more. As long as you do it right, they'll come back for more. They're addicted. And I think that's something we need to talk about, because that same type of expertise, I feel like could that be used to possibly depolarize? Just like you have antidotes to addiction, the opposite would be scientifically informed ways to, increase sobriety or get people to detox. Could you have an ideological detox? Could you, possibly have ways to get people to depolarize? And I feel like community might be the answer, getting people to bond together based on understanding fake news, questioning things. I don't know. I don't want to go on a rabbit hole here, but I feel like, can we weaponize these forces for good? Can these tech billionaires and brilliant people they recruit start to become Jedi to fight the Sith when it comes to this battle of disinformation, polarization, etc.? I mean, this is what I live and breathe. I'm like writing a book on this. I'm always thinking about this. I don't have a tech background, but I feel like some of you guys could be the Jedi, the Anakin, the Luke Skywalkers, the Reys, whoever.
That's a super fascinating idea. Actually, I think about 5 years ago, I tried to build a startup in my own free time that tried to do a little bit of the stuff that you're talking about. What I wanted to do was to build a social media platform that is more immune to trolls and malicious operatives, kind of like the PL person from St. Petersburg pretending to be a BLM person that you talked about. I kind of wanted to build a platform that's kind of immune to these things and really empower the voices, the people that are more trusted, that are a better source of information. And I also wanted to build a platform that exposes people to alternative viewpoints. Because I definitely do agree with you that, we definitely live in a time of self-polarization where, people watch MSNBC or Fox News or Infomax. They kind of self-select into their own ideological bubbles. And these bubbles don't portray the other side in a fair manner. And so then these bubbles really polarize and they make people become worse and worse. And they really see the other side as being the enemy. And I kind of wanted to really build a social media platform that encourages people to have their beliefs challenged and to see viewpoints representing the other side. Unfortunately, I was not able to succeed in building the startup. Even though I probably spent 6 or 9 months of building it, I spent $10,000 of my own money building it, but ultimately no one actually used it at all. So I feel like, there's definitely people out there trying to do these things. It's just really hard to find something that's both going to achieve the goals you talked about, but also succeeds in getting users, getting investors, and building a successful company out of it.
It looks like there might be a video on something similar that might, either amplify or counter my points. But I actually tried my own social startup when I got back from Afghanistan, and I know the frustrations, at least indirectly. So keep pushing, man. This is really good stuff. But yeah, did Thomas or Anat, did you want to pull up a video?
Yeah, and before we just cue it up, I guess to John's point about this kind of deep tribalism and polarization, I think I came across this video by Professor Massimo Pagliucci, and he is a huge proponent. Yeah. You know him, yeah. He's a huge proponent of stoicism, and take it for what it is, whether if you subscribe to their virtues or values. But I think some of the pillars that they stand for are kind of universal, because I think one of the things that we lack in our society, as John was talking about how people are so susceptible to being radicalized, I think we're lacking those pillars, whether on educational levels, on societal levels. And let's take a look at this video and we'll come back and comment on it. So.
The Stoics thought that we should take seriously human nature. And human nature fundamentally consists of two things, two aspects. One, we're highly social animals. We can survive on our own if we have to, but we only thrive in groups of people. We only thrive when we have healthy social networks. And two, we're capable of reason. Now, as you know, that doesn't mean that we're reasonable all the time. In fact, on the contrary, we struggle for that. But we are capable of reason. For the Stoics, it followed that the best kind of human life you can actually have is one in which you apply your reason, your intelligence, to improve social living, to improve everybody else's life. There are two fundamental pillars of Stoic philosophy, which we will see in a minute apply very practically to our life. One is the four cardinal virtues: practical wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. Practical wisdom is the knowledge of what is good for you and what is not good for you. Courage is not just physical, but especially moral, the courage to stand up and do the right thing. Justice is what tells you what the right thing is, how to interact with other people, how to treat other people. And temperance is the idea that you should always do things in right measure, not overdoing them, no underdo them. The second pillar is called dichotomy of control. This is the very basic idea that some things are up to us and other things are not up to us. That you can divide everything you do into these two categories and only worry about the first one and not the second one. For instance, I came here thinking that I could control the slides. As you've seen, that's outside of my control. Do I worry about it? No.
Okay, cool. So look, out of those four virtues, in my opinion, I think the one that our society lacks these days, it's temperance. I think that's like being not so much modest, but just not being extreme. And I think we're all kind of like competing against one another to some degree, for clickbaiting and attention grabbing and sensationalism. And we're always trying to outdo one another, whether if it's on social media or in real life. And I think that's really one of the, quite frankly, contributing factors to kind of this decay that we're seeing right now. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I feel like it's an arms race of stupidity. And as someone who, I'll tell you this, I grew up with a strong case of ADD and I still have it. And I remember Ritalin was a big thing growing up where they would medicate people. They didn't know what to do with people with ADD, so they'd medicate them on Ritalin. My mom refused to put me on Ritalin, so I had to learn the discipline to try to overcome this early on when I was in elementary school. Today's political landscape is like watching a bunch of people in middle school snorting Ritalin off the desk and just throwing chairs at each other. That's what it looks like. It's absolutely disgusting. I'm kind of a militant moderate in the sense that we need to be profoundly honest about how stupid and counterproductive this is. That's my take.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think there definitely used to be a time in the history when, the politicians who won elections, the politicians that people respected and looked up to, were the ones who were willing to, come to the middle and reach across the aisle and just, work on solutions and work on trying to work together with everyone. And it just seems like that's not the world we live in today. It seems like today the people who are becoming more influential, the people who are getting more power, are the people who are really playing to their own base and demonizing the other half of the country. And I think that's still going to be a very dangerous trend for the country to be going towards.
Yeah, and secondly, I think wisdom, which is one of the pillars of Stoicism, I think that's kind of important too, because as John had said, we're kind of racing towards, downwards towards reductionist stupidity. And one thing I've noticed in the last decade or so is this, anti-intellectualism, which is just, prevalent everywhere. It's almost like it's cool to be, I hate to say this for lack of a better word, but it's cool to be dumb because that's now acceptable. Again, dumb does not mean that you're necessarily, intellectually challenged, but just if you don't know anything, then yeah, that's great, And we're all kind of left to our own devices to then learn and figure things out. And sometimes, we're not quite good at that because we have so much knowledge and wisdom from the previous generation. We're just kind of ignoring that and we're just applying our own, where we're doing our own research into what the level of wisdom that we should attain ought to be.
I completely 100% agree with that. I think a good analogy that I always bring up to people is that, let's say you fall ill or you got injured. Would you seek medical advice from a doctor? Would you seek medical advice from a group of doctors? Or would you poll your 500 Facebook friends to find out what you should do about your illness or your injury? And I feel like, when you put it that way, people would be like, of course, I'm going to take advice from the doctors. They've, spent 10 years studying the medicine. They know the stuff really well. They're the people I want to get advice from. And yet, for some reason, when it comes to like other aspects of public policy or other aspects of life, there seems to be this idea that everyone's opinion is equal. And whatever the majority of the people believe, that's exactly what we should do. And I feel like respect for the fact that, someone has really spent a lot of time researching this, looking at the evidence, collecting the data. It's sad that people don't respect that, and they think that someone's uninformed opinion matters just as much as someone else's very, very informed and expert opinion.
So there's an analogy I try to use when it comes to epistemology. And for people listening, epistemology comes from the Greek word episteme. So it means knowledge. How do you arrive at answers? If I want to know the answer to a question, do I sacrifice a chicken or use, astrology, or do I actually look at data? And most people believe they accept this, except when it comes to their political views. And so I pose people the question, if there's a bomb going off in a major, building or something, what is the best way to arrive at answers as where the bomb maker is? Should you listen to FBI data and bomb experts that are working on the case? Or should you go throw darts at a board and or sacrifice a chicken, or go watch InfoWars and drink a bottle of whiskey? I mean, it's a question of how do you best arrive at answers. Almost everybody will say, of course we listen to the experts. The problem is when it comes to like COVID or anything like that, people do these mental gymnastics to rationalize their beliefs to meet the facts. So they arrive at things for emotional reasons, and then they find ways to fish for evidence to confirm what they already believe for emotional reasons. So they then think they arrived at that answer based on facts. And I think people are hardwired to do this because you want to feel like their beliefs are consistent to reduce that cognitive dissonance. So sadly, I did a lot of research on this, on echo chambers and ideology. And most people who believe things like COVID conspiracies, they could be pretty smart. Like smart people fall for conspiracies just as much, if not more, than dumb people. And smart people, what they do, like anyone, they tend to believe that they are listening to the experts, but they have different experts and different facts and different everything. They're in a bubble, and it's hard to penetrate that bubble.
Yeah, I think we have a perfect storm here. What John is describing is we have, on one hand, an institutional failure where an average citizen no longer trusts the recommendations coming from these agencies, whether it's the NIH, CDC, et cetera. So you have the institutional failure. And if you trace back to from the start of the pandemic, there has been some institutional failures, whether it's the communication, the guidance, the warnings, et cetera. And then on the other hand, each person now could be their own expert, because whenever there's some incident at stake, they could just go on Google and look it up, and you read a few articles and watch some videos, and guess what? Now you're an expert. So then you start blogging about it, and you start posting on social media about how you know this subject matter better than others. And then as these things kind of get lost in the echo chamber, then it becomes weaponized. So I think we have this kind of perfect storm of these things brewing together. And I think that's why, unfortunately, we've suffered tremendously during the pandemic.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I think, there's definitely been things, I think, even though I'm someone who really respects the CDC and Dr. Fauci, I think the one example that comes to mind is early on in the pandemic when there was a shortage of masks, and Dr. Fauci said, if you're an average person, you should not be wearing a mask because it's not going to help you. And I think looking back in context, he said it because at the time he felt that the masks were better used for the medical personnel who really needed it more than the average person. But I feel like those comments that he made at the time, they really fed into a lot of skepticism and a lot of distrust that has since happened. So I totally agree with you that, I think it's very important for every institution and for every, person in the authority position or expert to make sure that they're always practicing integrity, because it's so easy to lose people's trust. But that said, I definitely think there is a problem where, so our institutions are never going to be perfect. The people that we have in positions of power, they're never going to be perfect. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that even though someone like Dr. Anthony Fauci, he may not be perfect, he's still a really good person to be listening to. And I feel like that's something that we as society should really come around to.
Right. I mean, I'm really torn between Dr. Fauci and Donald John Trump. I think they're both equally valid and qualified to speak their opinions on COVID, just look at their track record. And by the way, this is heavy sarcasm, but I just wanted to throw that out there.
I was not sure for a second there if you were serious.
Oh my God, I've had this problem forever. So I have a dry sense of humor and I keep a straight face because I suck at numbers, so I can't play poker based on numbers, but I have a good poker face. So I've always had this problem of joking and people think I'm serious. But no, I think it really is a question of saying, look, you don't have to have blind faith in anything, especially not in our media, our government. Don't blindly trust any of them. The only thing that you should have faith in is the process of science and knowledge discovery. And the reason it works is because it accepts failure. It accepts when it's wrong. It constantly wants to know when its data is wrong. And when people need to change their mind and revise the belief, that by itself is the single most important thing in science, because science is all about understanding where am I wrong and having the intellectual humility, as Carl Sagan talked about, and countless people from Eisner to Aristotle have always talked about having the humility to say, well, the answer, here's where I'm wrong, I'm going to adjust my belief. That attitude is hard to infuse into our political conversation. And I really feel like it's all like app or virtual reality game or a series of videos to show young people it's awesome and beautiful and good to be willing to change your mind and say, I might be wrong. And that it's intellectually arrogant and stupid and harmful to think you have all the answers. And I'm wondering about incentives. So because there a lot of it there's a website called Rational Politics Project or Intentional Insights. They're both basically from a scientist, a guy named Dr. Gleb Sapersky, and they're based on promoting truth using incentives. So what he talks about is there's a reward and punishment system in human nature. If you reward people for a good behavior, they're more likely to repeat it. If you punish them, they repeat it. So politicians tend to lie because voters reward them for lying. It's almost like the pickup artist who picks up girls in a bar. Politicians are the modern pickup artist, and voters are the ones who continue to get screwed by the politicians because they reward them for lying, for devious behavior. And if a politician's too honest without the right nuance, they get punished. But if imagine the incentives were reversed, and if more voters would punish politicians for their superficial behavior and reward them with votes for being brutally honest, telling them what they don't want to hear, that would fundamentally change the game. And so, I don't know, educating people on rewards and punishments and incentives might go a long way, saying we should reward virtuous behavior. If you are wrong and you say, I predicted this about COVID, but I was wrong and I adapted my beliefs to the facts, that should be sexy as hell. That should be totally rewarded. If you continue to double down like Trump does, or like people do across the left and the right, and you just double down regardless of evidence, there should be a stigma on that. You should look like a complete asshole for that. I mean, I think we have to have a fundamental conversation about this. And I think most people are willing to have it, but most people don't want to start that conversation because of stigma.
No, absolutely. You're right. I think you're also right in saying that our leaders and our politicians are like really bad role models as far as the stuff you're talking about. Like, it is so easy to find examples of, your elected representative being a complete hypocrite, like just look over a 4-year time period, when one party's in power, they'll say one thing, and the other party comes to power, they say something completely opposite. And even when you point this out to them, they don't even try to explain it. They don't. A lot of times they'll just like, yeah, whatever, next question. And they know they're going to get away with it. They know that they can be hypocrites. They can contradict themselves. They can outright lie and not follow through on what they said. And no one's going to hold them accountable. And I think it's really sad that that's the kind of leaders that we end up with.
Although on the other hand, John, if you had elected officials who flip-flop too much, that's a problem too. You can't be, for climate change and then be anti-climate change and then change back again. So, I mean, ideally, you want these folks to be principled. Now, occasionally they might change certain things, like you said, based on changed circumstances, new data, et cetera. But you don't want them just flip-flopping because it's convenient. That's, that's the other alternative.
Right. And I get why people I get why politicians play the game to some degree, like why they might flip-flop. Like, I understand on some level that's a necessary evil. I totally get that. It's like you're a used car salesman. I understand if you watch Better Call Saul, you're Jimmy McGill. I get you got to be a little slippery and adaptable when you're a politician. I understand that. What I think we need to strive for is not perfection. We don't need someone perfect. We're never going to have someone perfectly honest, but we need to strive for just raise the bar a little bit. Just make it a little sexier and good to be truthful and change your mind. Even if you don't always tell the truth, just admit you're wrong, and a little more stigma on doubling down. If we can I don't want to say socially engineer, if we can facilitate that through a social movement that really values truth and humility and makes that attractive, that would be wonderful. And if the tech industry can find a way to do that, they should get a Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah. So the other thing I noticed about what we've gone through during the pandemic is that this notion of public health is not something that the US really places a premium on. Like when you look at other countries who were more successful in terms of limiting the spread and the number of deaths, they place a premium on public health. They almost treat it like it's like a public utility. There's like a public utilitarian approach to managing public health. What do you guys think about that? Do you think the US system is just too based on individualistic model, just kind of live and let live, and, every man, woman, and child, for themselves?
I guess I don't want to make too sweeping a statement. I guess it's also hard to figure out how much of America's COVID response was driven by, the president whom we happen to have in charge at that point in time, as opposed to systematic political structures in America. But I think it's definitely interesting to see other countries that have had much more strict lockdowns. I think my wife's actually from Australia, and I've seen how Australia and also Singapore, they've had really strictly enforced lockdowns. And I think they were very successful in keeping the number of COVID cases down. Whereas, there are many other places, including America, which had a more variation in how much lockdowns they experienced. And we definitely saw, a bigger outbreak of cases. But that said, I think having the right people in charge when a crisis happens, it really does play a big part. Even something as simple as, having a leader who encourages everyone to wear a mask during the height of the pandemic, and encourages people to practice responsible and moderate social distancing mechanisms. I think it really would have gone a long way towards helping making our situation better.
Do you think there's also a cultural aspect of it where, in nations like, let's say, Singapore and Australia, when there's a public recommendation or guidance, people really kind of heed the warning, they're trying to do something good, so we should follow it. Whereas in the US, we tend to do just the opposite because we are more, we don't want to be, kind of subjugated to these, strict measures. And we were always seeking, a way out. It's almost like telling a teenager, hey, you have a curfew and you cannot break it. But then an ordinary teenager would certainly find a way to break the curfew because they want to be more rebellious. And it seems like that's kind of ingrained in some aspect of US culture too. What do you think?
I think in a lot of ways that's absolutely true. I think one of the things that did surprise me when I moved to America for college was seeing how much distrust there was of the government in general in America. And I think I've seen this, when I first moved to America, George Bush was the president, and after that, Barack Obama was the president. And during both times, I definitely noticed that there was much more distrust of the government as a whole compared to Singapore, where people in Singapore implicitly have very strong faith in the government. They may not agree with everything the government says, and they do push back every now and then, but as a whole, people have trust in the government making good decisions, and that just doesn't seem to be the case here. That said, I also don't want to generalize. I think one of the things we saw during the pandemic was that there really is a huge divide in America. I think, there was one half the population that really came on board with the government wanting to put together these measures and lockdowns in order to contain the pandemic. They really tried to follow these guidelines. They followed the government's guidelines on wearing a mask, avoiding big gatherings, avoiding indoor dining, and so on. But there definitely does seem to be a second half of the country, which is a much more libertarian outlook on life, where they really do not take kindly to any infringements or any restrictions on their liberty. So I don't want to generalize, but it does seem like, there's definitely some camps that we saw during the pandemic that push back much more strongly on any form of government control or restrictions.
Right. Well, I think that's a really good point. And I think there's another 1,000-pound elephant in the room that we don't talk about, but we need to. Are any of you familiar with Dan Pallotta or his TED Talk on charity? So the idea there is that basically we have this very really oddly contradictory system of helping humanity when it comes to how we reward and compensate people in charitable fields. If someone wants to, find a cure, if they're the top of their field or the best of what they do, and you want to recruit them to accomplish the mission in a business sector, you're going to pay them really well. But if you want to make $500,000 a year curing children's leukemia, they say, well, you're a parasite for asking for that much money because it's a nonprofit. You're supposed to just sort of engage in this kind of servitude and not want to be compensated. But if you find a way to sell violent video games to kids, they'll put you on the cover of Wired magazine. So that's the analogy. And so this creates this kind of dichotomy in our society where, we've accepted for generations that if you're a good capitalist, you're able to make money, our society will worship you and reward you. And we accept that you make billions of dollars. But if you're helping humanity, if you're a school teacher and you're really passionate about what you do, but you can't pay your rent, you literally, I know school teachers that literally cannot afford to live in just a basic neighborhood. How in God's name does that happen? Because teaching schools is, teaching and educating the youth is the pillar of a free society. And I say this as a veteran of our military. Their job is as important as mine, just as important. If you take away education, we lose our freedom in a couple of generations. We're done. Teachers are just as important as soldiers. And yet we don't pay our teachers the way we should. So the idea is that we have this it might go back to the Puritans, but we have this weird stigma on compensating public sector professionals. So people who, doctors, nurses, teachers, we have this attitude of saying, oh, you're helping people. Attaboy, good job. Just, we're not going to pay that much. We're not going to recruit you from the top schools or whatever. We're just going to pay you enough just to survive. And we're going to say, good job. But at the end of the day, when these people are really needed, everybody loves them, but we don't pay them shit. And I think that's part of my language, but I think that's a huge mindset problem. We don't value public sector jobs in this country. And COVID exposed how dangerous this mindset is. And I think we need to really rethink that. I think, I don't know how you feel about that, but I think when I did startup work, and I'm sure you felt the same thing, whenever you're trying to help humanity or do something good, like combating trolls or disinformation, in my case, like building community in American neighborhoods using tools I learned from the war zone, how do you like, engage communities? When you do a startup, if it's like labeled as a social startup, then people think you're a nonprofit. Well, we don't need to actually pay you. You should work for free. And then I'm like, well, how do I work for free? Or if you're like, a public health worker or a teacher, you're like, well, okay, I'm not going to get paid that much. How do I put my kids through college? Then you're going to lose the motivation. And like, I'm motivated to do this no matter what, but most people are going to follow the money, and the talent is going to go to the public or the private sector. So we're draining these fields, and the ones that do an amazing job, we don't pay them. That's a huge problem. We need to talk about that.
I think you're absolutely right. This is actually something that I've experienced personally during my childhood in Singapore. One of my very close friends in Singapore, his dad was actually the founder and CEO of one of the biggest nonprofits in Singapore. It was a kidney foundation. They helped people afford dialysis and provide kidney services to them. And for a long time, this was one of the biggest nonprofits that existed in Singapore, and this guy made it what it was. He really helped to supercharge their fundraising, their efforts, basically everything in the organization. He really helped scale it up to a big level. And at some point, I think news got out about how much money he was making. I don't remember the exact details, but I think he was making something like $500,000 a year or 1 million a year or something. And I think it was exactly what you said. If this guy was, working in the for-profit sector, and if he was a CEO of a very successful company and he was making $5 or $10 million a year, people would congratulate him for being successful, successful in his career. But because he built a successful career in the nonprofit world, and the company that he helped to make really big was a nonprofit company, not a for-profit company. And for that reason, when people found out that he was getting paid very well, there was actually a severe public backlash. The buildings were vandalized, his family was getting death threats, and eventually he was forced to resign from his job just because of like the amount of backlash that he was getting, simply because of the fact that he was making, I think it was $500,000 a year or 1 million a year, something in that range. And yeah, I think it's really sad that, people have this expectation that if you want to pursue a career or a entrepreneurial goal in the for-profit sector, you're allowed to be as rich as you want. And the richer you become, the more we'll applaud you. But if you decide that you want to help people in the nonprofit world, then the exact opposite applies. If you want to help people and make a decent living at the same time, all of a sudden you're considered to be a very bad person. And I think that's a sad dichotomy to force on people.
Yeah, there's a comment in here where one difference between the US and other nations like Singapore is that public sector jobs are highly regarded there and well compensated, and just the opposite here in the US. And I think, we think of public sector employees as, they're just kind of like feeding off the system and they're not really providing service, whereas you go to places like Singapore or even in other European countries, and they really place a premium and kind of like this prestige on serving the public.
I think it's also worth mentioning one other thing, and I'm saying this without judgment. I'm not endorsing it, just saying, this is how the system operates in Singapore, which is that Singapore doesn't have the same level of democracy that America does, to be honest. Because in America, you have very contentious elections and you have a free media that, calls politicians out. You have politicians getting called out all the time. Singapore doesn't have that. In fact, the elections in Singapore are almost never contentious. Every single election that happens in Singapore, people know which party is going to win. And because there's no electoral pressure on the political party, on the government in Singapore, that allows the government to really focus on recruiting leaders and representatives who possess deep technical expertise, as opposed to people who are very charismatic and they know how to say the right things and they know how to get votes. I think it really shows, when you look at politicians in America, I'm actually very impressed by how charismatic they are. They are very well spoken. They're very good at reading public sentiment and playing to people's emotions and, being politicians, basically. They're really good at that. And when you look at politicians in Singapore, they're actually like the complete opposite of what you would imagine a politician to be like. They are, a lot of them they seem to be more introverted. They're not very eloquent. They sometimes say things that make them sound out of touch with the common person. They come across as elitist. They don't come across as someone who can relate to the average person. But at the same time, they possess a very deep level of expertise in like public policy, economic matters, healthcare, and all these things. I think, when we talk about something like a technocracy as opposed to democracy, I think like Singapore is actually a pretty good model for that. And I think that's responsible for both the pros and the cons of what you see in the Singapore system.
I was going to say a really funny comment from the debate in France is like watching paint dry. I think that's kind of a good analogy here. I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of differences across cultures and borders that really matters, and it's important to say why it matters. Yeah, it's like some people are very technical, others are very much about, they're very much about the facts, which is good, but it's boring. Whereas others are more charismatic and emotional, which is fun, like watching drunk people in a pub. But that's emotionally satisfying, but it's not helpful. And it's a spectrum, and you got to find that balance. So I don't know anything about Singapore where it falls in that, but I feel like some cultures value entertainment in their politics, like we do, unfortunately. And others are more about, hey, let's just cut through the brass tacks and find out what's true and get to the bottom of this. Like politics should be boring, I think it should be more technocratic and boring. It should not be the Kardashians, but sadly, it's much more on that end of the spectrum.
It's a funny thing you said about, watching a candidate debate in France, like watching paint dry. I would say in Singapore, there's actually no candidate debates at all. So I don't know if that analogy would even apply to Singapore.
That's awesome. No, it's great to hear your take on this. Also, something I wanted to return to briefly, what you said about happiness when it comes to the relativism of whether you're living in poverty or hardship or you've lost a limb versus living in a nice house. So I think the time that I most appreciated happiness, and I consider myself happy. I've always been, I think, happy on some level, but when I was going through hardship after my startup, and I went through a brief period of poverty, and I had to climb out of it, that was when I most appreciated being financially stable. And once I got financially stable, I felt a new sense of contentment I'd never felt before. It was like I appreciated things on a new level, and a good glass of wine or whatever was just so much better. And when I was working in Afghanistan, I was making, this is after the army, but I was working on the civilian side. I was making 6 figures, and I got back, and I could travel the world, and I could, I was doing something I passionately loved doing that, to be honest, I would have done for free. Like I was doing what I loved doing and getting 6 figures. That was awesome. But then when I got to take leave or travel, or when I got out, I was able to enjoy New York City or, part of many countries in Europe. And I was not rich. I was not I couldn't afford a yacht. I wasn't rich by any means, but I could fly friends over. We could enjoy good wine, go to restaurants, travel the world, or live in New York City and just have a brownstone apartment and just live without, have that freedom. That to me was that financial, that kind of freedom to me was so amazing. And then losing it after the startup and then climbing back on my feet, then I found a new level of happiness, just not being poor. It's hard to explain, but it's so relative to the suffering you go through and then escaping it. So gratitude and being grateful for your life, that's something I think that most Americans can relate to in their hardship. That might be the inroad to start the conversation about gratitude and about happiness and how that could affect everything,
Yeah, I think that's almost akin to, there's a book by David Brooks. I think it's called The Quest for Two Mountains. So sometimes you could, accomplish going over the first mountain, but it's really the quest for going over the second mountain that's sometimes the more challenging. And, mountain as like a metaphorical obstacle in life occurs in many different ways. Like in John's example, just kind of being on your feet again with the financial well-being is, overcoming the obstacle. So I think that the thesis to the book is that, just because you've gone over the first mountain, it doesn't mean that everything else is now on cruise control. You still have to strive for the next big obstacle. And I think the moral of the story is that you always want to kind of keep pushing yourself to, exceed expectations, if you want to say like personal goals. So.
That's true. I agree with both of what you guys said. I think, it's definitely true, John, what you said about how, going through hardships is not necessarily a bad thing. Like hardships really do fill your life with more purpose. They make your life experiences more memorable, and they make the good things that come after it, seem all the better because you've seen what it's like not to have them. And I think also, some of the stuff that you talked about, it sounds like a lot of things that gave you happiness and satisfaction came from having freedom and security. And I think we know that these are two of the most fundamental human needs, having the sense of freedom to do what you want, and also having a sense of security to know that like your basic needs for, food and shelter, it's going to be taken care of. And I think it's very hard to like be happy without these two things. And I think it's also great what you talked about traveling. I think there's a lot of research showing that, when people spend money on luxury purchases, like, fancy car or fancy house, that doesn't really have a good long-term impact on happiness or satisfaction. Whereas spending money on experiences, things like going to new places or experiencing things that you've not experienced before, things that make you think in a different way, make you open your eyes, those really do have a big impact on both our satisfaction and life happiness.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good point. And I'm grateful for all the experiences I've had, especially around the world. But I think for people that can't afford to travel, there's so many ways to cultivate our happiness. And I hope that technology can merge with moral philosophy and bring us together. By the way, there's a show called The Good Place on Netflix. Have you seen that? It's like the best show ever made on moral philosophy and comedy. I mean, there's really no show that's been made on that, but it's absolutely amazing. It's hilarious, very funny, but it literally invokes everything from Kant to utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill. It goes through like Aristotle. It goes through like every niche in philosophy, but in a comedic way. It's with Kristen Bell, Ted Danson. It has like this amazing cast, and it's hilarious. But it's a show about the afterlife and this kind of simulated reality. And it just is a layman's guide to moral philosophy. It's just about moral philosophy. If you have not seen that, please watch it. It's amazing.
Yeah, that's a really good recommendation. I've actually seen the show and I really liked it. I think
cool.
TD is definitely someone that I would love to meet in real life. If he actually talk about philosophy with him, I would love that.
That's awesome. Oh my God. People watching this who've seen the show will get the reference. Well, I still can't decide like what I want to do after this. I'm just torn in my indecision, that's an inside cheaty joke, but yeah, I think we've all known someone like that. Like every character in that is like someone we've known in real life, and it just really amazing the way it ties that together. But really, I feel like the focus of the show is not just moral philosophy. It's not the details. It really, the central premise seems to be about happiness. What makes people happy? The good place, the bad place. Aristotle's idea of teleology and what is, flourishing and what is ultimately the purpose. What is happiness? What do we really care about? What ultimately matters? What is the best model for people to be happy? That seems to be the premise of the show. And you could take that show and apply it to everything from justice reform to just personal meditation and just seeking fulfillment. It's amazing, I don't know.
Yeah, I definitely love the show. Highly recommend it. Everyone check it out.
So speaking of moral philosophy, Rajiv, are there any certain outlook points or pointers that you want to share with us in terms of how to enrich our everyday lives?
I'm definitely a fan of stoicism. I guess by moral philosophy, do you mean things like, morality and things like, Kantian ethics, utilitarianism, libertarianism, or did you mean more in terms of personal life philosophies that can help us find happiness?
Well, either or, we've covered quite a bit. So whichever you think is helpful for this discussion.
Yeah, sure. I guess this is a little bit off topic, but as far as like morality goes, the philosophy that I personally subscribe to is a rule-based utilitarianism. That's kind of that's the framework that I use in order to figure out what moral decisions or dilemmas I try to work towards. In terms of personal philosophy, I really do believe in stoicism, I definitely think that like pursuit of worldly success and seeking worldly validation is something that can cause a lot of, hurt and pain in all of us. I definitely noticed in a lot of cases where, when I get something like career success, for example, and I get too attached to it, it feels good in the moment when things go well, but when things don't go well, it also feels very hollow and it feels very deflating. And I think trying to find a way to like pull back from these things that are happening in the world, trying to not seek validation from other people, not trying to seek validation from your job, and instead really look inside of you to build that inner identity and inner validation, and really focus on, doing the right thing and not focusing on, am I, is this what I want? Is this meeting my expectations? And really trying to focus on going beyond that. I think to me, that seems like a better way to find happiness as opposed to trying to find it from extrinsic sources in the world. But, this is not something I'm an expert on. This is just something that I try to personally do in my life.
Well, that inner validation part that you mentioned, that's kind of interesting because people have different ways of, reaching that level. Is it through like meditation? Is it through certain achievements? Is it through certain routines? There are certain things that one should engage in consistently to really fully, appreciate the inner validation.
Yeah, what I personally like to do is to really try to engage in activities that make me feel good about the things that I'm doing. So, the two ways of seeking validation that people usually have is looking for validation outside versus looking for validation on the inside. So looking for validation outside is things like, getting your parents' approval or impressing your neighbors or winning over the romantic interests of someone whom you want to date or things like that. Whereas intrinsic validation, which I try to pursue, is things like, engaging in charity or donating money to charity, not because you're trying to impress someone else, but because it's the right thing to do, or dedicating yourself to activities and causes, which they may not be the most financially lucrative. They may not be things that get you fame and respect in society, but inside of you, that is something that you should be doing. It's something that you would feel good about doing. So just really pursuing activities and engage in activities that from within you, it's the right thing for you to be doing, as opposed to things that society tells you should be doing. I guess that's what I try to keep in mind on as far as seeking inner validation.
But it seems like a lot of that really involves, some degree of public good, right? Like you had talked about charity and volunteerism, altruism. I guess that kind of is aimed at promoting public good. Would you agree?
To a large extent, yeah. I'm definitely a rule-based utilitarian. So to me, when I think about what is the morally right thing to do or what is the morally good thing to do, I definitely come back to improving global utility. That's something that I definitely pay a lot of attention to. But that said, that's not the only thing. I think to me, I also try to focus on activities that engage my more creative side. Like, for example, I really enjoy both public speaking and I also enjoy reading and writing. So I really try to, spend time on writing. I have a blog that I actually have multiple blogs that I engage in. And I'm also trying to write a book. And I try to engage in activities like your political forum that I really enjoy participating in as a way to also cultivate my public speaking. So I guess to me, these are more hobbies and artistic activities. Like, for example, I know that writing is not something that's ever going to make me famous or impress my parents, for example, but it's something that I feel good about. At least I feel better about it compared to like watching TV, which I also do watch TV, but I feel more accomplished and I feel like my day has been better spent when I spend my day writing or reading or doing public speaking, for example. So I definitely do try to like, do things that reinforce utility to a large extent. But to me, inner validation is also about engaging in activities that you feel good and you feel proud of having done, even if no one else externally acknowledges it.
Yeah, so to some extent, it seems like we all need an outlet to kind of express ourselves and really, kind of continue our existence in different way of how we represent ourselves in society. And it seems like one outlet for you is writing and engaging in speaking engagements, etc. For other people, perhaps it's more like an athletic activity. I guess, John, for you, would be traveling.
Yeah, well, for like athletic activities, I love Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, MMA training, stuff like that. Hiking, swimming. I should do meditation. I'm too lazy, to be honest. I should do it. I know it's good. But for like culture, it's absolutely traveling, language, people, and just seeing parts of the world. I've done that my entire adult life, and I'm immensely grateful for it. But yeah, for me, those things are very fulfilling.
And do you think that during the last year and a half, during the pandemic, you're able to kind of hone those skills or have more time to engage?
Yeah, so the COVID forced me to try to be more mindful and effective of how not just happiness or contentment, where you have limited social ties. So you got to like adapt. It's got me to bond with languages on YouTube. So I started picking up Greek and Afrikaans, two amazingly beautiful. Greek is my new favorite language. I mean, Farsi, Iranian basically, or Afghanistan, they speak it too, but Farsi is one of my all-time favorite languages. It's so beautiful. I started learning Greek. I'm like, I'm just going to learn Greek. It's a pandemic, and if I can learn Russian, I can learn freaking Greek, right? It is a beautiful language. And then I started rebooting Swahili. So anyway, I went full on nerd with languages, but I had to learn to be efficient about it using YouTube resources. So I use like Language Pod, which has different conversations in all levels of languages, and a number of other things, but I couldn't practice them. So like to this day, I've had almost no chance to practice Greek or Afrikaans. Occasionally when I meet people, like I kind of impress them, but I don't know if I can sustain a conversation. Like I've never really practiced that enough so I suck at these languages for speaking, but I kind of know them. So the pandemic forced me to get good from like creative methods online. But now that we've lifted, now that there's more social contact, if I find people that speak Greek or Afrikaans or Swahili, I can go practice with them, which is awesome. So yeah, it pushed me into that niche. For working out, I had to learn to like go full on like creative prison workouts, like find scaffolding in Chinatown and do these, workouts on scaffolding and stuff. So yeah, I did like prison workouts. It's just freaking, yeah.
Just curious, John, I know you're a multilingualist, but can you just tell us how many languages you speak?
Oh my God. So it's like the stock market, it goes up and down. So fluent, when I say fluent, I'm not talking about native, but I'm talking about fluid exchange. So German and Russian are my best languages. I'm fluent in those. I'll bite in perfectly. Spanish and Arabic, I'm also arguably fluent. Not native. Once again, I make a lot of grammar mistakes in Spanish and Arabic, but I can converse fluently in all four of those, and also English. So that'll be 5. Then from there, it's a sliding scale downhill. So French and Italian, I'm good, but I kind of suck at speaking, but I can still talk. If you give me more glasses of good wine, I'll be better. Swahili, I'm really good at understanding, like I know the language, but I don't have anyone to practice with, so I suck at speaking Swahili. Serbian, Croatian / Bosnian, they're all kind of the same language. I'm pretty good. I'm conversational in that, but it's been a long time since I've been through the Balkans. So I'm lapsed, kind of like a lapsed Catholic, drink too much whiskey, whatever. I'm sort of a lapsed Serbo-Croat speaker. What else? Oh my God. Farsi. Farsi is my favorite language. When I went to Afghanistan, I was in a part in Nangarhar Kunar. They don't speak Swahili there. I'm sorry, they don't speak Farsi there. So they speak Pashto. So I would talk to people. I would have to learn Pashto. I'm not good in Pashto. It's a very hard language. It's like very rough. It's awesome. It's passionate, but it's very rough. And then I learned Urdu, which I spoke earlier tonight. Actually, I met a guy in a bar. He spoke Urdu. I'm not good at that either. Low level conversation, but it's beautiful language. And there's a number of others that I don't speak well. Like I was living in the Andes Mountains in Peru. I learned Quechua, which is the native language of the Incas. So I was like Kevin Costner proficient, where I could like talk to them like Kevin Costner did, but I was never that good. Like I could hold a little conversation, but not much. I'm forgetting some. There's others I study, but I can't really speak them, in a conversation.
Wow, that's quite impressive.
Yeah, I'm probably forgetting some, but I'm learning Portuguese and I'm learning a little Turkish, but I don't really speak those.
So out of those languages that you just mentioned, which one would you say is the most difficult or non-intuitive?
Oh, so no, that's easy for me actually. So Quechua is a Native American language, the language of the Incas, the most widely spoken language in all of like south of the border. It's just actually the most widely spoken Native American language in the world, even though it's heavily stigmatized in terms of like socioeconomic oppression of indigenous people in Latin America. It's still the most widely spoken in Peru, Chile, Bolivia, etc. But that was by far the most difficult. So I'd say Arabic's the hardest. I learned Arabic when I was a teenager through reading the Quran and talking to people. It took me a couple of years. Then I went to Iraq and I was in the army, etc. Arabic is very hard. Pashto, for some reason, Pashto is not as hard as Arabic, but Pashto was harder for me because like it's just I don't know how to explain it. It was really hard. So Arabic and Pashto would be the hardest. Then I would say Quechua is actually harder than both of those, like way harder. But compared to most Native American languages I've looked at, Quechua is the easiest. Like Native American languages get more difficult. They're so insanely complicated, weird by our standard, but so fascinating. Like I don't even know how to explain it. If you could, I don't know. It's like there's also African languages like isiXhosa, Zulu. I've studied. Grammatically, they're close to Swahili. They're not hard for me to like learn, but to speak them is really hard because of the grammar. French is easy and hard at the same time because it's like the pronunciation. It's hard to understand some people when they speak French, but it's real easy to speak. Spanish is the easiest to speak by far, but the hardest to get good at the grammar, like the slang. If you watch like Narcos or something on Netflix, that is Spanish is really hard at the highest levels of like speaking on the street. Arabic as well. So yeah, those are probably the hardest for me. Russian, Russian really. I'm fluent technically, but Russian is like they all sound like they're drunk when they talk really fast. Like when I watch Russian news, I understand most of it most of the time, but Russian can be really tricky. Like this probably sounds weird to most people that have never learned these languages, but they're hard for different reasons,
What about sign language?
My dad was fluent in sign language. I never was good. I'm not coordinated with my fingers or whatever. I never learned sign language. I don't know how I would do in that. It's completely, I think it's different parts of the brain. Like Broca's area, Wernicke's area, these are parts of the brain neurolinguistically where like you're better at languages if you're good in these parts of the brain, like pattern identification, etc. Sign language, I have no idea, and I should learn this. Also, I lived in Chinatown for like New York City 2 years. I tried learning Mandarin. I absolutely suck. I can't do Asian languages, man. I'm sorry. I tried to learn Korean because this girl I was with and years ago, and I know the alphabet, the Hangul alphabet, but I suck. Like Korean is, I don't know. I can't do Chinese or Korean or Japanese. I've never tried Japanese. Maybe I could do that, but I would say Mandarin basically, because it's so tonal, it totally kicked my butt. And I think tonal languages are my kryptonite. Like I try to talk to people and the words, the sounds are so tricky. So, which is weird because grammatically Mandarin's not hard. It's just the way the pronunciation. So.
Yeah. What about you, Rajiv? Do you want to share with us how many languages you know?
Oh man, I feel like such a big letdown after John. That was super impressive, John.
Don't worry about it. I'm a weirdo, dude. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, my list is much shorter. So obviously I speak English. The language that my family speaks at home is called Marathi. It's the language they speak in the middle of India, in Bombay or Mumbai. That's the main language that's spoken in the biggest city in India. The third language that I also speak is Tamil. That's the language they speak in the southern part of India, which is actually where my family is from. So the language that me and my family speak at home is actually different from the language that we were speaking outside of our home while living in India. So we learned both Marathi and Tamil. The one language that I tried to learn, not successfully, is Hindi, which is actually the most common Indian language. I've been trying to learn it just because I know that is the most common language. So, when you meet an Indian person in America, chances are they're going to speak Hindi. That's the only language that they will know. So I always felt like I was not a good Indian just because I never learned the most dominant language of Hindi. So that's something that I tried to learn over a period of 1 or 2 years, but I think I just don't have the same knack for picking up languages. I learned all 3 languages when I was a kid, and I've found it really hard to learn languages ever since then.
Right. Let me send you some links for Hindi. Language Pod's a great link, but also I study like the languages of India. So as a linguist, I study even languages I don't speak. I study the alphabets and the history. And India is probably, in my opinion, as a subcontinent, one of the most fascinating places in the world, archaeologically and historical language-wise, for languages. So like Tamil and Telugu are like Alamo-Dravidian languages, totally different family than the Indo-Aryan. And I've looked at like Malayalam and these others, and it's just amazingly like, and your alphabets are so freaking cool. If aliens were to come to the earth and the alphabet, it's basically Tamil or Telugu or Punjabi or Orissa. I could name like 20 languages in India. All of their alphabets are so freaking cool. Like Predator probably uses that alphabet. It's like freaking awesome.
No, that is really true. When I was growing up in India, and the language that we spoke at home, Marathi, it's, in the northern family of, I think, Indo-Aryan languages. And the language of Tamil, which we spoke outside of home, was the Dravidian language that you mentioned. And yeah, they are so far apart from each other. I had a really hard time as a kid, learning one language at home and then speaking another language outside the home. And yeah, they're just so far apart from each other. It's interesting how you have 2 completely different language families both mixing in the same country.
It's so weird. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, if Marathi, I think that's sort of close to Hindu, the way like Assamese or Bengali, where they're not the same, but there's a lot more proximity there than your southern languages. That's, I don't know, man. It's so fascinating. Same thing with African languages. I could talk all day about it. It's an entire continent. You have so much diversity, but the key to languages is have a few beers. Don't be afraid to make a mistake. Screw grammar. Learn the fundamentals. It's like learning boxing or jiu-jitsu or any MMA. Your goal is to make mistakes and learn from your mistakes. Don't have an ego. You're going to get your ass kicked. Continue to play around, have fun, be humble. Don't worry about grammar. Then once you play in the water and learn to swim and talk, that's when you build your grammar. You start from the bottom up. That's why the way you teach it in schools, absolutely is in so many ways is backwards. People take 4 to 7 years of Italian or French or whatever. They can't speak it. I've heard this dozens of times. It's not their fault. It's the way they teach it. It's backwards. Grammar should come last. fluidity and practice should come first. Then you learn the grammar, build it outward, but start with basic patterns of like word order, vocabulary, and just start with the basics. Let people play in the boxing ring a bit and just enjoy the language and learn from there using muscle memory. Then throw in the grammar, but gender pronouns and cases and all that stuff, that should come last. I've been saying this for years, but the academia will never agree with me on this. So it's a losing battle, I think.
I actually 100% agree with you on that. I never actually learned English grammar at a formal level. Like I have no idea what a split infinitive or a complex adverb or any of these terms. I have no idea what they mean. I never actually learned any of these things. The way I learned English was just to spend a lot of time reading and writing and hearing other people speak English. And I just like picked up on the patterns. And now it's like when I hear something that's grammatically wrong, it just sounds funny to me. And that's really how I know whether something's grammatically correct or wrong. It's just, does it sound funny to me? And I guess with practice, I just picked it up.
Yeah, that's how we get fluent in the advanced military training, like when we went through Defense Language Institute. That's pretty much how it works. No, that's absolutely true. And if we want to get people fluent in Spanish in America, everyone, above the age of 5 should get immersion training. We have all the tools. We literally have all the tools to teach millions of kids who are like 5 years old or whatever, to get them fluent in Spanish by the time they're in middle school. We have all the tools to do that. We could experiment in any major city in America. Why has that not happened? Someone answer me that. Seriously, like every other countries do this. We have all the tools. We can do it. We don't.
Yeah.
So
I think that's called American exceptionalism, where your only option is just one language, and you don't need to leave the borders of the U.S. because we're so
great.
set.
Those people that believe that don't understand how painful it is to get fluent in a language artificially. Like the difference between getting fluent in a language through training versus learning it through osmosis as a kid, the difference is so huge. It's like, imagine if you could just like have it download in your brain through a phone app. Like people have no idea. When we train our spies, our intelligence operatives, our special operations, and I have some background in special warfare, right? There's a lot of resources invested in getting these people minimally proficient languages. That is extremely hard. Take your most badass Navy SEALs, Green Berets, whatever. They will tell you that most of them struggle with the language. That's hard. That's just intuitively very difficult. I struggle, to get good in a language. Everyone struggles, right? And you're saying we love our special operations people, we love our spies, we love our CIA people, but we could just train them as kids. We could train like this entire country to know a second and third and fourth language, but we don't. I don't know. I don't get it. It's so labor intensive.
I think sooner or later, some of these lesser used languages will be defunct, because I think with the rise of globalism and use of social media, a lot of these words are becoming very internationally used, and some of these terms are based on like technological advancements, Wi-Fi, USB, internet, etc. So I think when you look at languages, let's say 3 centuries down the road, you're only going to be left with maybe major branches of languages, like Slavic, Romantic languages, English. But I think some of these lesser used languages might just disappear. That's my prediction.
Interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. It's hard to say. I mean, we have plenty of people who are fluent in Spanish, but I feel like from a national security perspective, get more people fluent in French. Africa has a lot of French speakers. It's a very different type of French, but and also like a lot of languages go extinct. I've been involved for a long time in looking at extinct languages, especially in Latin America and to some degree Africa. Native American languages, like if we use technology to help revive Cherokee, for example, and Cherokee is by no means extinct, but it definitely needs a revival. And I say this because so many native speakers just, it means the world to them when their native language is empowered and understood and spoken. Or, it really, I can't explain how much it means to people when their native language is, salvaged or preserved, or at least appreciated, and more people can learn it. The youth can learn it. It's something I saw when I was in Cusco in Peru, and it's very much something people talk about with a lot of Native American languages, like Cherokee and others, like the actor Wes Studi, the guy from Last of the Mohicans, Avatar, Dancing with Wolves. He's a big activist for Cherokee. I think he's a speaker of it, but that's a big deal. Is like Native American languages have been like, sorry to hit on this. It's one of my big points on my, I wish we could apply technology and language acquisition to go into Native American communities and let them, not tell them what to do, but let them build their own system based on what they need, based on what they want. Let them build their own system of teaching a language to their kids to preserve it. That to me is amazing. It's a project I've never had the time to get involved with, but I wish someone would do it. I just think that's a beautiful thing.
Well, I guess that's a good place to leave it. But before we wrap it up, Rajiv, I know you're an avid reader, so do you have any book recommendations for us?
Yeah, sure. I guess, we talked a little bit about moral philosophy, and I think John also brought up a good point about the good place and all these different moral philosophies that came up in the good place, Aristotelian ethics, Kantian ethics, utilitarianism, libertarianism, and so on. I think to me, what really kickstarted my journey into moral philosophy was this book called Justice by Michael Sandel. He's actually a philosophy professor at Harvard, and I think he does a very common and very popular course at Harvard about moral philosophy. And I think this book really gives a very good summary of, all the different major branches of moral philosophy. And it goes into, the most common arguments for and also the common arguments against it. So if you're looking for a way to get your intro to moral philosophy, I think this is a very thought-provoking book full of, very interesting theories and principles and ideas that are very relevant to the public policy debates and moral dilemmas that we face in the world today. I like this book.
Excellent, and thanks for that, Rajiv. So once again, I want to thank Rajiv for being our guest tonight, and also thanks to our team members, John, Anat. Appreciate everything, and we'll see you guys at the next episode. Take care.